The story begins with the introduction of an old hospital, closed for years, which used to be a refuge of hope and healing. Its walls, now worn down, echo the whispers of lives that once passed through. It was a place that, in its prime, witnessed stories of struggle, triumph, and also loss. But now, its corridors remain empty, except for one creature that found shelter there, a gray cat with piercing eyes and a restless soul. This cat, later named Charlie, didn't know where he had come from. One day, he simply appeared around the abandoned hospital and never left. His days were solitary, marked by the sound of water dripping from the ceiling and the wind howling through broken windows. He wandered through the empty hallways, as if searching for something or someone. Charlie wasn't just another stray cat. There was something in his eyes that conveyed an unusual wisdom and melancholy. It was as if he understood human pain, as if he carried the memories of those cold walls within himself. He was a shadow, moving silently, watching everything, waiting for something he couldn't yet name. Things began to change the day an ambulance parked in front of the abandoned hospital. The medical team accompanying the patient, an elderly man named Samuel, had no other choice. The traffic was chaotic, and the nearest hospital was too far away. Samuel, frail and ill, was in critical condition. He suffered from a heart condition, and his strength was fading rapidly. In a desperate measure, the team decided to bring him into the abandoned hospital, improvising an emergency room until they could move him elsewhere. Charlie observed everything from a distance, his eyes fixed on the sudden activity. He didn't know what to make of this new presence, but something about Samuel drew him in. Perhaps it was the vulnerability on the man's face or the way his eyes sought comfort amid the pain. And so, without anyone noticing, Charlie approached. Slowly, he entered the room where Samuel lay, surrounded by improvised medical equipment. The cat, with his majestic yet humble posture, leapt onto the elderly man's bed and curled up beside him, as if he knew that his mere presence could make all the difference. Samuel, who could barely speak anymore, felt the gentle touch of Charlie's fur. His tired body relaxed, and for the first time in days, he closed his eyes with a sense of peace. Charlie purred softly, as if he were trying to calm the heart of the man who was on the verge of giving up. As the days passed, Charlie never left Samuel's side. He was there in every moment, day or night. The patient, who had once seemed beyond hope, began to show signs of improvement, something that left everyone around him astonished. The medical team, even though skeptical, couldn't ignore the connection between the cat and the man. It was as if Charlie was more than just a cat. He was a guardian, a friend, a presence that brought comfort amid despair. The story that began with an empty hospital and an abandoned cat was about to transform into something much greater. And what happened next would change Samuel's life, and the lives of everyone around him, forever. Samuel, now more stable, continued to be monitored by the medical team temporarily stationed in the abandoned hospital. But despite the apparent improvement, something still troubled him. The man, who had once been strong and resilient, felt like a prisoner of his own memories. Samuel was a widower and had lost his wife, Helen, just a few months before. Her absence consumed him, and the emptiness in his chest seemed to grow with each passing day, worsening his condition. Every time he closed his eyes, Samuel was haunted by memories. He and Helen had spent decades together, building a life of love, companionship, and dreams. But when she passed so suddenly, everything crumbled. He had distanced himself from his family, preferring to isolate himself in his grief, and he never found a way to accept the loss. Now, the cold and empty hospital seemed to echo that silent mourning. Charlie, always by Samuel's side, seemed to sense the shadows that surrounded him. The cat, with his quiet loyalty, offered more than just companionship. He seemed to understand Samuel's pain in a way no one else could. In moments when the old man became more agitated, his breathing labored, and silent tears fell from his eyes, Charlie would climb into his lap and curl up, as if trying to absorb all the sadness hanging in the air. The doctors caring for Samuel were amazed by the emotional strength the cat seemed to provide. To them, Charlie was more than just a feline. He was a being that brought an energy of healing, even though no one could scientifically explain what was happening. One of the doctors, Dr. Miller, even began to wonder if Samuel would still be alive if not for the constant presence of the cat. "He seems to calm down only when Charlie is near," Dr. Miller commented to a nurse. "It's like the cat is an anchor, keeping Samuel here in this world." However, Samuel's condition remained unstable. His heart, already weakened by age and illness, fought a daily battle. Some days, he seemed ready to give up, staring at the ceiling of the empty hospital as if waiting for someone or something to take him away. And there were other moments when he clung to life, especially when Charlie was nearby, purring softly as if singing a song of hope. Slowly, Samuel began to share his story with Charlie. In low, almost whispered conversations, he talked about Helen, about how they met, how she was the kindest and strongest woman he had ever known. Samuel also shared the guilt he felt for not being able to save her when she needed him most. Helen had died of a sudden heart attack, and despite doing everything he could, Samuel couldn't get there in time to save her. This guilt consumed him, gnawing at his soul, worsening both his physical and emotional state. As Samuel confided in Charlie, something within him began to change. He realized that, in some way, he was finally confronting his pain, a pain he had avoided for months. It was as if the cat were the only being capable of listening to his anguish without judgment, without trying to rationalize or minimize his loss. Charlie was simply there, present, like a silent friend who carried the burden of suffering alongside him. However, as the days passed, Samuel's condition began to worsen again. Despite the medical care and Charlie's constant presence, his body was tired, and his heart, both physically and emotionally, was too weak. He began slipping in and out of consciousness more frequently, sometimes speaking incoherently and, at other times, calling out for Helen, as if she were standing beside him, waiting for him. Charlie, loyal and constant, never left his side. Even when the medical team had to adjust the machines or check Samuel's vitals, the cat remained close, his eyes alert, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. One night, Samuel had a dream. In it, he was in a vast field of golden flowers, and in the distance, he saw Helen. She was radiant, as if time had never touched her, smiling at him with tenderness. "I'm waiting for you," she said, her voice soft like the breeze. But beside her was Charlie, silently watching, as if he too belonged to that world beyond life. When he awoke, Samuel was different. Though still frail, there was a peace on his face that hadn't been there before. He knew that his journey was nearing its end, but somehow he no longer feared it. The presence of Charlie, by his side, seemed to seal this feeling of tranquility. However, the conflict was far from over. The final battle between life and death was approaching, and Samuel, now at peace with his memories and his pain, would soon face the most decisive moment of his life. Samuel's days were clearly numbered. The doctors knew it, but there was something different in the air. The atmosphere, once heavy with despair, began to shift. Somehow, everyone in the hospital could feel it. Samuel, now more serene, seemed to have accepted what lay ahead. He no longer spoke as much about the pain of loss, and when he mentioned Helen, it was with a melancholic smile, filled with tenderness, as if her memory now warmed him instead of hurting him. However, despite this acceptance, Samuel's heart remained fragile. One afternoon, during one of the frequent moments when he slipped in and out of consciousness, his pulse weakened drastically. The monitor beside the bed began to beep, alerting the medical team that something was wrong. They rushed to stabilize him, adjusting medications, checking his vitals, trying to get Samuel's heart to beat strongly once again. But it seemed that, this time, he was finally slipping away. During this frantic process, Charlie was there, as always, watching closely. But then, something different happened. The cat, who had previously stayed by Samuel's side, leapt onto the old man's chest, curling up directly over his heart. The medical team stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. Was it just a coincidence? A natural instinct of the cat? Or was there something deeper happening? Dr. Miller, who had always observed the connection between Samuel and Charlie with a near-scientific curiosity, hesitated for a moment. He knew Samuel's heart was on the verge of stopping, but he also couldn't ignore what he saw. Somehow, Charlie's presence on the old man's chest seemed to stabilize him, if only just a little. The cat's steady purring filled the room with an energy that no one could explain. Then, Samuel opened his eyes, still weak but conscious. He looked directly at Charlie and whispered something that no one could quite make out, but it sounded like, "Thank you." That simple act of gratitude seemed to carry a deeper meaning. It wasn't just for that moment. It was for everything the cat had done since the beginning. Charlie hadn't just been physically present. He had helped Samuel face his darkest inner demons. But the most pivotal moment was yet to come. That night, as the medical team kept a quiet vigil, something unexpected happened. Samuel, who had accepted the end, suddenly felt a warmth spread through his body. He looked up at the ceiling and had a vision, clear as day, as if he were floating between dream and reality. He saw Helen again, standing in the distance, smiling at him with the same love and tenderness she had always shown. But this time, she wasn't calling him. She just looked at him, sending a silent message. He wasn't alone, not now, not in what was to come. Suddenly, Samuel understood. It wasn't time for him to go. Not yet. There was something more he needed to do, something Helen seemed to want him to discover on his own. And that's when, for the first time in months, he remembered his granddaughter, Deborah, a young woman he had pushed away since Helen's death, simply because he didn't know how to deal with his grief. Deborah was his only living family, but he had never had the courage to face her after losing his wife. He knew she was suffering too, but in his mourning, he isolated himself, losing the connection with the person who loved him the most. With a newfound strength in his heart, Samuel did something unexpected. He asked to see Deborah. He barely had the strength to speak, but he managed to convey this desire to the medical team. Dr. Miller, surprised by this sudden change in attitude, did everything he could to reach out to the young woman. She lived in another city, and because of Samuel's withdrawal, she had no idea how critical his condition had become. When Deborah received the call, she was shocked. Her grandfather, whom she thought had disappeared into his sadness, was now asking for her. Without hesitation, she caught the first flight she could and rushed to the abandoned hospital where he had been temporarily treated. Time seemed to be running against them, but at the same time, there was a sense of hope in the air, something that even the doctors couldn't explain. It was as if Charlie's presence was somehow delaying the inevitable, giving Samuel the time he needed to make amends with his family. As they waited for Deborah to arrive, Samuel remained calm but visibly emotional. He knew he needed to reconcile with his granddaughter before he left this world. Something in his soul cried out for it. He couldn't leave without asking for forgiveness and ensuring that Deborah knew how much she was loved, even in the midst of his pain. Finally, the decisive moment was approaching. Deborah would arrive soon, and Samuel, with Charlie by his side, prepared himself for the most important encounter of his life. One that, in his heart, he knew could no longer be delayed. Deborah arrived at the hospital in the dead of night, her heart pounding with anxiety. It had been months since she last saw her grandfather, since her grandmother's funeral. On that day, Samuel seemed like a shadow of the man she once knew, a man who had been strong and full of life, now consumed by grief. She had tried to reach out, but he had pushed her away, withdrawing into his own pain. Since then, silence had filled the space between them, and Deborah resigned herself to waiting, hoping that one day he would find a way to deal with his loss. As she entered the abandoned hospital, Deborah was greeted by Dr. Miller, who gave her a brief update on the situation. "He's weak, but he's conscious." "He asked to see you," the doctor said, with a look of surprise mixed with relief. Deborah didn't know what to expect, but the very idea that her grandfather had called for her after all this time filled her with both hope and fear. When she stepped into the makeshift room where Samuel lay, her heart almost stopped. The man in the bed was frail, much more than she had imagined. His eyes, however, were open, and in them was a tenderness that Deborah hadn't seen since before her grandmother's death. Beside Samuel, curled up calmly, was the gray cat, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. "Deborah," Samuel whispered, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "I'm so sorry. Sorry for everything." Deborah approached the bed, her eyes filling with tears. "Grandpa, you don't need to apologize. I just wanted to be here for you." He took her hand with the little strength he had left. "I pushed you away. I didn't know how to deal with the pain, and I ended up hurting you too. Please forgive me." Deborah, who had held back her tears throughout the journey, finally broke down. She leaned down, resting her head on her grandfather's chest, feeling the fragile warmth of his body. "Of course I forgive you, Grandpa. I always have. I just wanted you back." The moment was one of pure reconciliation, a meeting of souls that had lost their way. Samuel, with Charlie's constant presence beside him, purring softly, felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. The guilt he had carried began to dissolve, and he realized that, despite all the suffering, there was still love. There was still family. In the days that followed, Samuel's recovery surprised the medical team. It wasn't a miraculous cure, but it was as if the weight he had carried in his chest had been lifted. He remained frail, his body still weakened by the illness, but there was a peace in his expression that no one could ignore. Deborah visited him every day, and together they reminisced about the past, laughed at happy memories, and, most importantly, reconnected in a way Samuel had never thought possible after Helen's death. Charlie, for his part, continued to stay by Samuel's side, as loyal as ever. The cat seemed to understand the role he played in the emotional healing process. He didn't need to do much. His mere presence was enough to provide comfort and tranquility to both the old man and his granddaughter. Over time, Samuel began to express his gratitude in a way that touched everyone. He thanked the medical team, Dr. Miller, and most of all, Deborah, for not giving up on him. But more than anything, he was grateful to Charlie. While he couldn't put into words what the cat meant to him, everyone knew that without Charlie, Samuel likely wouldn't have found the strength to keep fighting, to reconnect with his granddaughter, to let go of his guilt, and embrace the love that was still left in his life. There was a moment, during one of Deborah's visits, when Samuel took her hand and placed it on Charlie, who was lying in his lap. "He brought me back," Samuel said with a gentle smile. "He helped me remember what's important." Deborah, tears welling up in her eyes, stroked the cat. She understood what her grandfather meant. Somehow, this cat, who had appeared so unexpectedly, had become the link Samuel needed to cross the chasm of grief and find his way back to love. Samuel's health continued to fluctuate. Though he was emotionally stronger, his body was still fighting a losing battle. He knew that his time was coming, but now he was at peace with it. He knew he was no longer alone. He had the comforting presence of Deborah, and of course, Charlie's quiet loyalty. When Samuel's final moment came, he passed away peacefully, surrounded by those he loved. Charlie was by his side, as always, and Deborah held his hand. There was no more sadness, only a serene acceptance. The cycle of grief and reconciliation was complete. Samuel left this world with a light heart, knowing that he had said his goodbyes to his granddaughter with love and that, somehow, Helen was waiting for him in another place. After the funeral, Deborah took Charlie home with her. She knew that the cat was part of her family now, and in a way, he continued to bring the same sense of peace he had given to Samuel. Every time Deborah looked at Charlie, she remembered her grandfather, and how, in the darkest moments, there is always a chance for healing, love, and reconciliation, even when it seems all is lost. After Samuel's passing, Deborah's life changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. The pain of loss was still real, but something inside her had shifted. The final weeks she spent with her grandfather weren't just a farewell. They were a lesson about the value of love, reconciliation, and the time we so often let slip away. The grief was still there, but now it was accompanied by a sense of gratitude. Charlie, the cat who transformed Samuel's final days, was now a part of Deborah's life. Every time she saw him, she felt as though a piece of her grandfather was still with her, present in some way, watching over her. Charlie, with his deep, calm eyes, continued to play the role of a silent guardian, as if he knew his mission wasn't over yet. For Deborah, he was more than just a cat. He was a symbol of second chances, of love rediscovered in the hardest moments. Samuel and Charlie's story resonated deeply with everyone who knew it. It wasn't just the tale of an old man who found comfort in his final days. It was a story of how love can be rediscovered, even at the end of life's journey. Samuel was gone, but he left behind a legacy of reconciliation and peace, something Deborah would carry with her for the rest of her life. There's something special about animals like Charlie, who seem to perceive human pain in a unique way. They don't speak, they don't judge, but they're there, present, offering exactly what we need in our loneliest and most desperate moments. For Samuel, Charlie was that presence who helped him find peace in his final days. And for Deborah, the cat became a living reminder of the love that never disappears, even when those we love are gone. In the end, Samuel's story, his life with Helen, and his reunion with Deborah, reminds us that time is precious, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes, the simple act of forgiving and opening up to those we care about can bring us the peace we seek, even in the darkest of times. And, of course, it reminds us that help can come from the most unexpected places, even from a silent cat who appears when we need it most. Charlie, faithful to the end, teaches us that while life is fragile, the love we share with others is eternal. And so, Samuel's story doesn't end with his death, but with the continuation of love, healing, and the presence he left behind, reflected in the watchful eyes of a cat who changed everything.